I'm sharing this story because even now, years later, I still think about how differently that night could have ended. At the time, I was 21 years old and working the closing shift at a convenience store on the outskirts of my city. The job wasn't great, but it paid enough to cover my college expenses. Most nights were uneventful. I'd stock shelves, clean up, count the register, and then catch the last bus home around midnight. I had been doing the same routine for almost a year. That's why what happened that night caught me completely off guard. It was late November, and the weather had become unusually cold. The store closed at 11:30 p.m., and by the time I finished counting the cash register and locking everything up, it was almost midnight. The streets were nearly empty. I remember pulling my jacket tighter around me as I walked toward the bus stop. The city looked completely different at night. Places that seemed normal during the day suddenly felt unfamiliar. The bus arrived a few minutes later. There were only 4 other passengers on board: an older woman sitting near the front, a teenager staring at his phone, a man asleep against the window, and another guy sitting alone near the back. I took a seat somewhere in the middle and put my headphones on. For the first 15 minutes, everything was normal. Then I noticed something strange. Every time I looked up from my phone, the man sitting near the back seemed to be staring directly at me. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. People zone out all the time during long bus rides, but after the 4th or 5th time, I realized something was wrong. The moment our eyes met, he'd quickly look away. Then a few minutes later, I'd catch him staring again. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. About 20 minutes into the ride, the teenager got off. A few stops later, the older woman left too. Now there were only 3 passengers remaining: me, the sleeping man, and the guy watching me. I remember feeling relieved when the sleeping passenger suddenly stood up, but that relief disappeared almost immediately when he exited the bus. Now I was completely alone with the stranger. The driver was separated by several rows and a plastic barrier. The bus suddenly felt much bigger and much quieter. I looked out the window and realized we had entered the industrial section of town. Most of the buildings were warehouses. There weren't many street lights, almost no traffic, just darkness. That's when the stranger stood up. My stomach immediately dropped. He slowly started walking toward the front of the bus. I told myself he was probably getting ready to exit, but instead of stopping near the door, he sat down directly across from me. I could feel my pulse speeding up. The bus was practically empty. There were dozens of open seats, yet he chose the one directly facing me. I pretended not to notice and kept looking at my phone. A few seconds later, I heard him clear his throat. Then he spoke. "Long night." I looked up. He was smiling, but something about the smile felt wrong. I forced a small nod. "Yeah." He continued staring. "Where are you headed?" The question instantly made me uncomfortable. I gave a vague answer. "Just home." He nodded slowly. Then he smiled again. "I think we're getting off at the same stop." The words sent a chill through me because I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen him board almost 40 minutes earlier. If he lived near me, I would have noticed him before. I didn't respond. The rest of the ride felt endless. Every few minutes I'd glance at the bus driver, wondering if I should move closer to him, but I didn't want to look paranoid. So I stayed where I was. Eventually my stop appeared. I stood up. The stranger stood up too. That was the moment real fear started creeping in. The bus stopped. The doors opened. I stepped outside. A second later, I heard footsteps behind me. The stranger had gotten off too. My neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it was quiet. Very quiet. Especially after midnight. There were no stores, no restaurants, no people walking around. Just rows of houses and long stretches of road. I told myself he might genuinely live nearby. But then I noticed something. Every time I turned a corner, he turned the same corner. Every time I crossed the street, he crossed too. Always maintaining roughly the same distance. Never getting closer. Never falling behind. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I pulled out my phone and called my friend. He answered immediately. I didn't tell him what was happening. Instead, I started having a normal conversation, or at least I tried to. The truth was, I was watching the stranger the entire time. After another minute, I decided to test him. Instead of taking my usual route home, I made a random left turn into a residential area. I had no reason to go that way. It was completely out of my path. The stranger followed. At that point, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. He was following me. I quietly told my friend everything. His tone changed instantly. He told me not to go home, not under any circumstances. Instead, he told me to walk toward a gas station about 6 blocks away. It was open 24 hours. I immediately changed direction. The stranger changed direction too. My hands were shaking. I remember looking over my shoulder and finally getting a good look at him beneath a streetlight. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face looked completely expressionless, almost emotionless, like he had been caught. and for some reason, that scared me even more. I started walking faster. So did he. I walked faster again. This time, he matched my pace almost immediately. That was when panic took over. I broke into a jog. The stranger did too. I can still remember hearing his footsteps behind me. Not running, just jogging, matching my speed, keeping the distance exactly the same, as if he knew something I didn't. I sprinted the final block toward the gas station. The bright lights came into view. I nearly ran through the front doors. The cashier looked startled as I entered. I immediately turned around. The stranger was standing outside, not moving, just watching. The automatic doors closed between us. For what felt like forever, he simply stood there. Then he slowly turned around and walked away. I stayed inside the gas station for almost 45 minutes. Eventually, my older brother drove over and picked me up. We searched the surrounding streets before leaving. The stranger was gone. I never saw him again, but the story doesn't end there. 2 days later, I returned to the gas station to thank the cashier. While we were talking, I mentioned the man who had followed me. The cashier's expression immediately changed. He asked me to describe him. When I did, he became very quiet. Then he told me something that still gives me chills. According to him, several customers had reported a man matching that exact description over the previous few months. The reports were always similar. Late at night, bus stops, people walking home alone. The man would follow them for blocks, sometimes longer, but nobody knew who he was, and nobody had ever reported being attacked, at least not officially. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was harmless, maybe he was mentally ill, or maybe I escaped something much worse simply because that gas station happened to be open. Whatever the truth is, one thing has stayed with me ever since. The image of him standing under those bright gas station lights, completely motionless, watching me through the glass, as if he was deciding whether or not to come inside. The story I'm about to tell happened 3 years ago when I was 24 years old. I've told only a handful of people about it, because every time I explain what happened, I end up replaying the entire night in my head. Even now, there are details that don't make sense, and honestly, I'm not sure they ever will. At the time, I was renting a small house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story home with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fenced backyard. The neighborhood itself was peaceful. Most of my neighbors were older couples who had lived there for years. Crime was rare, and people generally knew each other. Because of that, I never felt unsafe living alone, at least not until that night. It was a Friday evening in early October. I had just finished work and stopped by a grocery store on my way home. The weather was cold and rainy, the kind of rain that isn't heavy enough to soak you immediately, but keeps falling non-stop for hours. By the time I got home, it was already dark. I remember bringing the groceries inside and locking the front door behind me. That detail is important because I know for a fact that the door was locked. I cooked dinner, watched a few videos online, and spent most of the evening relaxing. Everything felt completely normal. Around 10:30 p.m., I started getting ready for bed. Before going to sleep, I always did the same routine. Check the front door, check the back door, make sure the windows were locked, turn off the lights, then head to bed. That night was no different. Everything was secure, or so I thought. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up unexpectedly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was completely dark. The rain was still falling outside. For several seconds, I just lay there staring at the ceiling. Then I heard it, a faint noise. It sounded like something moving inside the house. Not outside, inside. I sat up immediately. The sound stopped. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe the house was settling. Old houses make strange noises all the time. I lay back down. Then I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. A slow creaking sound, like someone carefully stepping on a wooden floor. My heart instantly started racing. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 2:07 a.m. The noise came from somewhere near the kitchen. I held my breath and listened. Another creak, then another. Each one separated by several seconds, as if someone was trying not to make noise. I felt frozen. My bedroom door was partially open, allowing me to see a narrow section of the hallway. Everything looked normal. Nothing moved, but the sounds continued. Creak, silence, creak, silence. I quietly reached for the baseball bat I kept beside my bed. It wasn't much, but it made me feel slightly better. For several minutes, I sat there listening. Eventually, the noises stopped completely. The silence that followed felt even worse. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I heard a few creaks in an old house? I knew they'd probably think I was paranoid. After another 15 minutes passed without any sounds, I slowly started calming down. Maybe it really was the house settling. Maybe I had overreacted. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The front door was locked. The back door was locked. Nothing appeared missing. I almost laughed at myself for being scared. Then I noticed something strange. One of the kitchen chairs was pulled away from the table, not by much, only a few inches. But I lived alone, and I always pushed the chairs in. At first I thought maybe I had forgotten, but the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to prove anything, so I tried to move on. For the next few days, life returned to normal. Then Thursday night arrived, and everything changed. I had stayed up later than usual watching a movie. Around midnight, I headed toward the kitchen to grab a drink. As I walked past the hallway, I froze. One of the bedroom doors was open. The spare bedroom, the room I never used. I always kept it closed, always. I stared at it for several seconds. Maybe I forgot. Maybe it had swung open somehow. Trying to convince myself of that, I walked over and pushed it shut. The room was empty. Nothing appeared disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. The following evening, after work, I stopped at a hardware store and bought a small security camera. Nothing fancy, just a basic motion-activated camera. I set it up facing the hallway before going to bed. Honestly, I expected it to record absolutely nothing. I mostly bought it for peace of mind. At around 6:30 the next morning, I woke up and immediately checked the footage. At first, everything looked normal. Hours of empty hallway, nothing moving, nothing unusual. Then I reached a clip recorded at 2:43 a.m. The camera had detected motion. My stomach immediately tightened. I pressed play. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the spare bedroom door opened. Not all at once, not quickly, slowly, as if someone was carefully pulling it open from the inside. I felt cold all over. The door opened roughly halfway, then stopped. No one appeared. Nothing stepped into the hallway. After about 20 seconds, the door slowly closed again. The recording ended. I watched the footage at least 20 times. I couldn't explain it. Maybe air pressure, maybe a faulty latch. That had to be it, right? But deep down, I didn't believe that explanation, because the door didn't drift open. It moved with purpose, slowly, deliberately, as if someone was controlling it. That evening, I called my brother. He came over after work and watched the footage himself. The first thing he asked was whether anyone else had a key. I told him no. Then he asked if there was an attic. There was. A small attic accessible through a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling. Neither of us had ever checked it. The house owner told me it was mostly empty storage space. My brother grabbed a flashlight. I grabbed the bat, and together, we climbed up. The attic was dusty and cramped. At first glance, it looked empty. Then my brother pointed toward the far corner. There was a blanket, folded neatly. My heart nearly stopped, because that blanket didn't belong to me. Next to it sat several empty water bottles, food wrappers, and something else, a backpack. Someone had been up there recently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The realization hit us both at the same time. Someone had been living inside the attic, directly above me, possibly for days, maybe weeks. We immediately climbed down and called the police. Officers arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the entire property. By then, whoever had been staying there was gone. They found no sign of the person, no fingerprints they could identify, no clues revealing who it was, nothing. The officer told me something that still unsettles me. Apparently, cases like this happen more often than people realize. Sometimes, homeless individuals secretly live inside attics, basements, garages, or crawl spaces without homeowners realizing it. Usually, they enter while the house is empty, then leave before anyone notices. What terrifies me is not knowing how long that person was there. How many nights had they watched me? How many times had they walked through my house while I slept? Were they responsible for the noises, the moving chair, the opening door, or had there been even more incidents I never noticed? I moved out less than a month later. The landlord eventually changed all the locks and sealed several access points around the property. Nothing like that ever happened again. But even today, years later, I still check every room before going to bed. I still double-check every lock. And every now and then, usually when I'm trying to sleep, I remember that security footage, the spare bedroom door slowly opening by itself in the middle of the night, because now I know something I didn't know back then. The door wasn't opening on its own. Someone was standing behind it, and they were trying very hard not to be seen. The story I'm about to tell is without question the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation for it, but no matter how many times I replay that night in my head, I always end up with the same conclusion. If just one small thing had gone differently, I genuinely don't know if I'd be here telling this story today. This happened when I was 20 years old. At the time, I was attending college and working part-time at a warehouse. One Friday night, a group of friends invited me to a birthday party about an hour away from my house. I wasn't much of a party person, but I hadn't seen some of those friends in months, so I decided to go. The night was great. Everyone was laughing, eating, and catching up. Nothing unusual happened. Around midnight, people slowly started leaving. By 1 a.m., only a few of us remained. I checked my phone and realized I still had almost an hour's drive ahead of me, so I said goodbye and headed home. The route back was mostly rural roads, long stretches of highway, small patches of forest, occasional gas stations, very little traffic. For the first 30 minutes, everything was normal. Then I noticed a pair of headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Cars travel the same roads all the time, but after about 10 minutes, I realized something strange. No matter how fast or slow I drove, the vehicle remained the exact same distance behind me, not gaining, not falling back, just staying there. I remember checking my mirrors repeatedly. The headlights never disappeared. Eventually, I turned onto a smaller road leading toward my town. The vehicle turned too. That was when I first felt uneasy. Still, I tried to stay rational. Maybe the driver lived nearby. Maybe we were simply heading in the same direction. About 5 minutes later, I stopped at a red light. For the first time, the vehicle pulled close enough for me to see it clearly. It was an older white van, no company logo, no markings, just a plain white van, the kind you'd never notice during the day. The light turned green. I continued driving. The van continued following. At this point, there were almost no other vehicles on the road, just me and the van. I told myself that if it followed me through one more turn, I'd know something was wrong. A minute later, I made a right turn. The van made a right turn. I made a left. The van made a left. My stomach dropped. I was being followed. There's no other way to describe it. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend. Thankfully, he answered immediately. I explained everything while keeping one eye on the road. He told me not to drive home. Instead, he suggested I head toward the nearest police station. That sounded like the smartest option. I immediately changed direction. The van remained behind me. At first, I felt relieved. I figured whoever was following me would eventually give up, but they didn't. In fact, something happened that made the situation even worse. The van suddenly accelerated. The distance between us began shrinking, fast. My heart started pounding. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The van matched my speed. For the next several minutes, I drove faster than I probably should have. Every time I looked in my mirror, the van seemed closer. It felt like the driver had finally decided to stop pretending. I remember my friend constantly talking through the phone, trying to keep me calm, telling me how far away the police station was. But honestly, I barely heard him. My entire focus was on the road and the van behind me. Then something happened that I'll never forget. The van turned its headlights off completely. 1 second I could see it. The next second it vanished into darkness. I nearly slammed on my brakes. The road was pitch black. Without the headlights, I couldn't tell exactly where the van was anymore. Only occasional glimpses of its outline under distant streetlights. The move felt deliberate and terrifying. The driver wanted me to lose track of them. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I might crash. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the steering wheel steady. Then suddenly, the headlights came back on, much closer than before. I actually yelled. The van couldn't have been more than 2 car lengths behind me. At this point, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Whoever was driving that vehicle was intentionally targeting me. The police station was still several minutes away, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I'd make it there. Then I noticed a brightly lit gas station ahead. Without thinking, I pulled into it. I expected the van to keep driving. Instead, it followed me into the parking lot. My fear instantly turned into panic. The station was open, but there were only 2 cars outside. I parked near the entrance. The van stopped several spaces away. Its engine remained running. I immediately jumped out and ran inside. The cashier looked startled. I quickly explained what was happening. The moment he looked outside and saw the van, his expression changed. changed. He picked up the phone behind the counter. I assumed he was calling police. For the next minute, I watched through the window. The van didn't move. It just sat there, engine running, lights on, waiting. Then another vehicle entered the parking lot, a police cruiser. I've never felt relief like that in my life. The second the cruiser turned into the station, the van suddenly reversed, then sped away. The officer immediately pursued it. The cashier and I watched as both vehicles disappeared into the night. I spent almost 30 minutes giving a statement. Eventually, another officer arrived and escorted me home. I barely slept that night. The next day, I called the police department hoping for answers. Unfortunately, they didn't have many. The officer told me they had located the van abandoned several miles away near a wooded area, but the driver was gone. No arrests, no identification, nothing. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. 3 nights later, something happened that still chills me whenever I think about it. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud knocking sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then it happened again. 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Coming from the front door. I checked my phone. 3:04 a.m. Immediately, I felt uneasy. Nobody visits at 3 o'clock in the morning. Nobody. I stayed completely still. Several seconds passed. Then the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, almost patient. I quietly got out of bed and looked through a second-floor window overlooking the front yard. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing at my front door, completely motionless, just staring at the house. Because of the darkness, I couldn't make out his face, but I could see enough. He was wearing dark clothing and standing perfectly still. Then he slowly turned his head upward, toward my window. It felt as though he knew I was watching. I ducked down immediately. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. Very wrong. I called police. While waiting, I remained hidden near the window. Several minutes passed. No more knocking, no sounds, nothing. Finally, distant police lights appeared. I looked outside again. The man was gone. Officers searched the entire area. No sign of him. No footprints. No vehicles nearby. Nothing. When I described what happened, one officer asked an unexpected question. He wanted to know if I had recently experienced anyone following me. The question caught me completely off guard. When I mentioned the white van, his expression changed. Apparently, another person had reported a similar incident less than 2 weeks earlier. A white van, late-night pursuit, and a stranger appearing outside their home days later. To this day, police never identified the driver, and they never determined whether the man at my front door was connected to the van. Maybe it was all a coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But here's the detail that still keeps me awake sometimes. The officer told me something before leaving that night, something I wish I never heard. When police reviewed nearby security cameras after my report, they discovered that the man had been standing outside my house for nearly 40 minutes before he knocked. 40 minutes, just standing there, watching, waiting. And if I hadn't woken up when I did, I honestly don't want to think about how much longer he might have stayed.